Hey, Larkin Rose here, and we are quickly approaching the global release of the Jones Plantation movie on August 5th, where will be the watch party. Below you can find the link to be in on that, and then after that people can buy the movie just by itself for like $10. But I thought this was an appropriate time. I've mentioned the works of Frederick Douglass on many occasions over the past many years. As someone he's famous and well known, and there's like schools named after him by people who don't at all understand what he said. But he was a slave. He grew up as a slave, and his accounts of his experience and his spiritual awakening, philosophical awakening, whatever you want to call it, to me is one of the most amazing examples of like inspiring human greatness. And I say that because for those of us who live in a pretty easy world and a pretty easy life, which is almost everybody in this country right now, relatively speaking, like people can have lots of problems and they can be in debt and whatever else. But for a lot of human history, the goal was to not die on any given day. Like that kind of isn't really a threat to the vast majority of us most of the time. We're not starving to death. If anything, we're like overweight and spoiled and lazy and stuff. So to try to picture people who really lived through like really nasty situations and to try to imagine what it was like to be in somebody's shoes where they accepted that as the norm, as that's just how things are, that's really difficult to relate to. And the reason I often suggest that people read what Frederick Douglass wrote is because from our comfy vantage point now, and this is true whether you're white or black or anything else, like it doesn't matter. From our comfy vantage point now, it can be really hard to relate to or even comprehend what it must have been like to grow up as a slave, surrounded by slaves, indoctrinated into the notion that slavery was legitimate. Now, I've mentioned that a lot of times, that Frederick Douglass himself explains how some slaves would view it as theft for a slave to run away because he was stealing himself from the master. That's how much they were trained to think that it was real and legitimate and that they were obligated to serve the master well. Now, at the same time, they suffered, obviously. They weren't having a grand old time. It was dreadful. So there's this weird dichotomy that can be hard for people to imagine now of how could you possibly be a victim of, like, kind of the worst injustice there can be, maybe short of murder, but to be treated as property, as if somebody else owns you, that's kind of as bad as you can get. It's about as bad as you can get. How could people live in that and suffer and have their, their stories and their songs, lamenting the injustice and the suffering and the hardship, and at the same time view it as sort of legitimate and the way things are and the way things have to be? And it's really hard for normal people to comprehend that these days, because it seems like it would take sort of an insane level of like schizophrenia, split personality, something or other, to recognize and suffer through the evil and lament it and dream of freedom, and at the same time imagine there's something legitimate about it. But I think it's really important for people to know things like what Frederick Douglass wrote, to actually see not the physical control, because that's sort of obvious and easy to understand. You chain someone to a tree and you force them to work, but the mind control, the mental control, the psychological control, because to me, that is way more important to understand. Because if somebody is free in their own mind and you like chain them up and make them work, okay, that's really horrible and evil, but in their own mind, they know that's not okay, they know it's not legitimate, and the moment they have a chance to get away, they will, even if they have to like kill their abuser or enslaver or captor or whatever you want to call them. But the mentality, the process that Frederick Douglass went through is just so amazing. And I cannot nearly assume I could ever have gone through that process starting where he started and so eloquently ended up with his understanding and expression of not only the evils of slavery, but his own sort of revelation of what was going on, in spite of the fact that he was surrounded by it, and that was just the status quo. So I'm going to do a series of videos here where I just take a little snippet of stuff he wrote. I highly recommend people read the whole story. Because as they relate, I'm not going to give all the details of his particulars, but the pieces of it that relate to the psychology that is still relevant. And here's the first one that I stumbled on when going through his autobiography, which is actually, I think it's just like a collection of things he wrote. I don't think he put them together, but whatever. He wrote this. So he wrote this after being a slave. But Frederick Douglass describes this, quote, "Slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented and that their masters are kind." Okay, this is a slave. This is someone who grew up as a slave saying that. And I bet most people, white or black, today would go, what? They say nice things about their master? But listen to this. "The slaveholders have been known to send in spies among their slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition." Incidentally, there was going to be a scene in the movie about that, but it was one of the characters and subplots that had to be cut to keep it down to time. That is actually going to be in the novel version. Yes, there will be a novel version of the movie too that can put back in all the things that didn't fit in the movie. So back to what he's saying. "The frequency of this," as in the slaveholders having spies, "had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head." In other words, don't bash the master because it'll get back to him. "They suppress the truth," he's talking about the slaves, "they suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in so doing prove themselves a part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. I have been frequently asked, when a slave, if I had a kind master." This is Frederick Douglass speaking. "And do not remember ever to have given a negative answer. Nor did I, in pursuing this course, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false. For I always measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set up among slaveholders around us." So there was nothing objective. There was no saying, this is slavery, this is evil, duh. What do you mean? Why would you even ask me that? It's like, well, I guess this is how this is. And compared to the other nasty people around, I guess the nasty person who abuses and owns me and treats me like property and views me as property, I guess he's okay, so I'll say nice things about him. And this is somebody who outgrew that and figured out why that was wrong. Oh, man. Trying to imagine thinking about it. "Moreover, slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves. And this too, in some cases, when the very reverse is true." What does that sound like to you? I'll give you a hint. Drive around and watch someone waving an American flag. "America #1! Yeah, but America isn't you. You're not waving the flag of you. You're waving a flag that represents the republic that abuses you and robs you and controls you and defrauds you and limits you and restricts you and bosses you around. And yet, if you're the average American, you proudly tell the world how your abuser and enslaver and theft is the best, and you wave his flag. Indeed, back to Frederick Douglass's words, "It is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel amongst themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of others." Imagine that, when the slavery was just outright. And these people grew up being told, you are the property of that guy. And they still, because of the psychology involved and the indoctrination involved, they would still argue that their master is the better. At the very same time, they mutually execrate their masters when viewed separately. So they see the evils, just like everybody can point to the politicians and say, yeah, they're a bunch of slimy crooks and they don't do what we want and they rob us and they control us, blah, 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 blah. Well, then does America suck? No! Ours is the greatest. And you can see the same mentality and the same weird contradiction and paradox in the way people talk about it. They will complain about their abuser and yet praise their abuser as the best abuser around. And by the way, this psychological phenomenon also happens in smaller examples of abuse where, you know, some kid who gets beat up by his dad on a regular basis, he'll say, you're horrible, it's unfair, and he beats me up. And if somebody goes, yeah, your dad is an asshole, you can't talk that way about my dad. There's this weird, sad, pathetic attachment, the Stockholm Syndrome thing, being attached to the one who abuses you, where you're allowed to complain and suffer and recognize this is not okay. But if somebody else bashes them, you suddenly take it personally and get defensive of the person abusing you or enslaving you, as in this case. So here's the last part of the quote I'm going to read for this one. Quote, they seem to think, meaning the slaves, they seem to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. Can you even freaking imagine that? I mean, I can read his words and know that, yeah, that guy actually lived a lot of his life as a slave. And I can see parallels today. But the parallels today, you know, the situation we're in today is a whole lot less openly violent and horrible suffering, and, you know, you're not getting whipped to death and on the brink of starvation and any of that. We are way more prosperous while being robbed by parasitical thieves and tyrants. So I'm not nearly, and would never compare the severity of the situation. But if you can't recognize the similarity of the psychology involved, then you're just not looking very hard. And there's a lot of things that Frederick Douglass talks about that show that to a disturbing level. But the fact that somebody can abuse a bunch of people or claim to own them, and because of how our weird brains work, if they're indoctrinated into thinking, well, this is how it is and we're obligated to obey, you'll still see people making excuses for their own abusers and literally bragging that their abusers are the best abusers around. Well, what other country would you rather live in? You've probably heard that response to somebody pointing out, this government in this country, bad things are happening here. Yeah, we're pretty dang prosperous, and we have a certain amount of freedom in certain ways, kind of. It's been dwindling for a long time. But a lot of times when people go, I'm not going to wave the flag and praise this country and call it the land of the free, because it isn't. You need permission of the ruling class to do almost anything. And how do other people respond? This is the greatest country, and if you don't like it, just get out. And what country is better than this one? Why don't you move to North Korea? It's literally as twisted and insane as somebody saying, yeah, my dad gets drunk and beats me up every other night. And somebody saying, well, if you don't like it, why don't you go to the neighbor whose father is even a worse, more violent drunk? Then see how you like it. What kind of insane response is that? It's the kind of insane response a brain has to manufacture to try to be at peace with an obvious injustice. They have to compare it to something else to not admit to themselves what they are and what's being done to them. Because to admit that and then to keep going along with it would just be unbearable. Like you have to just confess, I'm a piece of crap and being treated like a piece of crap and I'm not doing anything about it. That is the recognition that Frederick Douglass eventually came to, that this all the way isn't okay. And comparing masters, that's irrelevant. That doesn't stinking matter. I own myself. And I don't know if he ever put it in those words, but you can very obviously see that he came to that conclusion and he figured out, I'm not this guy's property. And for those of us today, it can seem like, why on earth would that take that much time and effort to figure out you don't belong to another human being? Well, if you're surrounded by people who think that slavery is just how things are, and it's legitimate, and even if you complain about, this is horrible and we're suffering and stuff, but oh well, it's legal and stuff, and he bought me fair and square, and if that's the mentality of everyone around you, most people do not have the philosophical awareness and the strength to see objective reality and morality while indoctrinated into that situation. And again, I would never compare the degree of injustice happening now to like chattel slavery, but the mentality is the same. Millions and millions and hundreds of millions of people working their butts off and being constantly robbed by these political parasites. They have to tell themselves excuses for why this is legitimate and necessary and this is how things have to be. And furthermore, ours is the greatest country. Our abusers are the greatest abusers. Don't you dare talk bad about our abusers. And so if one of their fellow slaves, in the analogy, says, yeah, our abuser is a piece of crap. This is not okay. This is not acceptable. This is not legitimate. This is not moral. Most of the others will respond by hating that person for trying to put in front of them a truth that makes them too uncomfortable. And there's a scene in The Jones Plantation that is specifically about that. And it's one of my favorite scenes. It's rather intense. And I like it because it needs to be. Anyway, I'll probably do a few more series with bits and pieces of, straight from Frederick Douglass's own hand, writing these things down and describing his own experiences, because he had a first-hand view, not just like the slave master's view of what the slaves are thinking, but a slave's view of what his fellow slaves are thinking, and what they feel, and how they behave, and how they view things, and what they accept and what they don't. And it's a creepy, disturbing thing. And, I know a lot of people don't like to read things that are that, about something that heinous, because he tells, some pretty heinous stories of how slaves were treated, which was badly, in case anybody wonders. And so it's not an easy read, and it's not a fun read in a bunch of ways, but I think it's really damn important for people to understand the mentality and the psychology that was required to have slavery be an institution. Because, and I've said this before and some people get offended and I don't care, you cannot have slavery exist just by way of brute force. Because if all of the victims recognize this is totally wrong and I have the right to escape, I have the right to defend myself, I have the right to kill the master, the owner who doesn't own me, he's just some guy. If that's what it takes to get right, I have a right to do that. That is how we want to imagine people thinking. And if people thought that way, there never would have been slavery. And it's not just in this country, and it's not just white and black. Most of the world has had slavery for thousands of years, with all sorts of different colors, enslaving all sorts of different colors back and forth. That was just kind of the way things are. And culturally, it's like, yeah, if you can conquer and dominate and enslave somebody, but to adopt the mindset of a slave, that is the real problem. Because if all the people refuse to adopt that mindset and say, yeah, you might victimize me, you might chain me to a tree so I can't get away, you might whip me until I work, but at least in here, I know that I own myself and that this isn't okay. And the moment I have a chance to change it, to escape, to overthrow the master, whatever, I'm going to. When this changes to the point where people are free in here, the external problems will go away sooner or later, and probably sooner. But until that changes, nothing improves. If people think like subjects and slaves, they will remain subjects and slaves forever. And the grand extent of what they can comprehend as an improvement is just hoping a slightly nicer master owns them next time. That's called democracy. I'm going to vote into a guy who, yeah, he's still going to boss me around, he's still going to take my money, but hopefully he'll be a little bit more lenient. And anyway, don't want to get too much into what the movie shows, but very soon you'll all have a chance to see the movie, because it covers that too. But yeah, I think it's worth putting in the uncomfortable effort to actually imagine, why did anybody ever put up with slavery? And the answer is really creepy and scary, because it wasn't just brute force. It was mental and it was psychological. And that's the only reason it was ever going to happen. So anyway, that's the first one. There'll probably be a few more. Again, the link below shows you how to sign up for the August 5th online watch party, the global release of the Jones Plantation movie. And then after that, people will be able to buy the movie just by itself for like $9.99, I think. And we'll be doing things to try to show it in theaters and a bunch of other stuff. And there'll be a DVD released at some point. We're going as fast as we can with the budget we have, which is basically nothing, and the crew we have, which is basically nothing. It's like 3 people as the entire group trying to promote this thing. So, but yeah, see that link below. And yeah, the purpose of these little snippets I'm going to do from Frederick Douglass is kind of similar to the purpose of the movie, which is to get people to look at the mental and psychology side of slavery, because that is way, way more significant and important, both to understand the problem and to understand the solution, as compared to just like physical brute force. Who cares? That's temporary. That can be overcome relatively easily. But the mental, if you don't overcome the mental, you're never, ever going to be free, not even inside your own head.